Today, I want to share why life in Canada slowly reshapes the American mindset, not through shock or conflict, but through calm routines, restraint, and a very different emotional rhythm asterisk at first glance. Life in Canada appears deceptively familiar to Americans. The language is shared, the infrastructure feels recognizable, and daily routines seem to follow a parallel logic. Yet beneath this surface resemblance, a quieter shift begins to take place. The contrast is not loud or immediate. It unfolds gradually, embedded in tone rather than spectacle, in what is not said as much as in what is. Over time, this subtle difference begins to reorient expectations, priorities, and emotional reflexes in ways that are difficult to notice until they have already taken hold. Early impressions are shaped by an atmosphere that feels noticeably lower in tension. Public spaces move at a steadier pace. Interactions carry less urgency. There is a sense that life is not constantly accelerating toward the next outcome. For many Americans, this creates an initial feeling of calm mixed with uncertainty. The familiar signals of ambition, competition, and visible striving are present, but muted. Achievement exists, yet it does not dominate the social environment. Success is less frequently announced, less tightly woven into everyday identity. This difference becomes more apparent through small, repeated encounters. Workplace conversations tend to avoid overt self-promotion. Social gatherings rarely revolve around professional status. Questions about personal life emerge more gently, without the implied pressure to demonstrate progress or upward momentum. Over time, Americans often notice that explanations are shorter, opinions are softened, and certainty is treated with caution. The cultural instinct leans toward moderation, not as indecision, but as a form of social balance. Underlying these behaviors is a distinct relationship with stability. In the United States, change is often framed as virtue. Movement signals growth, reinvention is encouraged, and rest can feel like stagnation. In Canada, continuity holds greater value. Long-term routines, predictable systems, and institutional trust form the backbone of daily life. This creates an environment where urgency fades, replaced by patience. For Americans accustomed to measuring time in milestones, this shift can feel both relieving and disorienting. Gradually, emotional responses begin to recalibrate. Situations that might provoke frustration or confrontation elsewhere are met with restraint. Discomfort is managed quietly rather than challenged openly. Conflict avoidance is not rooted in fear, but in a collective preference for social cohesion. As Americans adapt to this rhythm, reactions soften. The impulse to assert, to clarify, to push forward begins to slow. This change is rarely conscious. It does not arrive as a decision, but as an accumulation. The absence of constant comparison reduces internal pressure. Without the need to continuously declare purpose or trajectory, the emotional landscape flattens. Life feels less performative, less defined by visible benchmarks. What remains is a steady, understated sense of order that gradually reshapes how value, time, and self-worth are perceived. As this adjustment deepens, everyday behavior begins to reflect a quieter internal shift. Decisions are made with fewer extremes. Risk is still present, but it is measured, weighed against long-term comfort rather than short-term gain. Many Americans find that their instinct to accelerate, to optimize every moment, to extract maximum productivity from each day gradually loosens. Time stretches differently. Evenings feel less crowded with intention. Weekends are less about recovery from pressure and more about maintenance of balance. Social dynamics reinforce this transformation. In group settings, pauses are longer. Silence is tolerated rather than filled. Opinions are offered tentatively, framed as perspectives rather than declarations. Assertiveness, while not discouraged, is carefully modulated. Emotional restraint becomes a shared language. For Americans raised in environments where clarity and confidence are rewarded, this restraint can initially feel like emotional distance. Over time, it reveals itself as a form of respect and unspoken agreement to avoid dominating shared space. Public institutions play a subtle but influential role. Systems tend to function with fewer dramatic failures and fewer dramatic successes. Bureaucracy moves slowly, but predictably. Expectations are managed downward, which paradoxically increases trust. Americans often notice that complaints are expressed less publicly, less performatively. Dissatisfaction exists, but it is rarely amplified. This creates an atmosphere where emotional regulation is modeled daily, shaping responses without explicit instruction. Work culture further embeds this mindset. Ambition is present, yet it is tempered by an emphasis on sustainability. Long hours are less glorified. Burnout is acknowledged without being romanticized. Professional identity does not fully eclipse personal life. As Americans adapt, the boundary between work and self begins to solidify. Achievement becomes something one does, not something one constantly signals. Over time, the internal narrative shifts. The constant forward pull that defines much of American psychology weakens. Goals remain, but they feel less urgent, less existential. There is room for ambiguity, for periods of plateau without immediate justification. The pressure to reinvent softens, replaced by a quiet permission to remain. This gradual rewiring is not without tension. Some Americans experience a loss of intensity, a sense that emotional highs and lows have been compressed. Others experience relief, discovering a steadier baseline that reduces anxiety. In both cases, the change is subtle and cumulative. It emerges through repeated exposure to a culture that values composure over display, balance over momentum, and continuity over reinvention. That as this mindset settles, perception itself begins to change. Success is no longer evaluated through constant comparison, but through comfort with sufficiency. Emotional responses flatten not into indifference, but into steadiness. The absence of urgency creates space for reflection, even if that reflection is rarely verbalized. Daily life becomes less about proving trajectory and more about maintaining equilibrium. This recalibration influences how meaning is constructed. In an environment shaped by American logic, meaning is often produced through momentum movement toward visible outcomes, narratives of progress, measurable growth. In Canada, meaning emerges from reliability, the repetition of stable systems, the predictability of social expectations, and the quiet persistence of routine create a different psychological anchor. Life feels less dramatic, but also less fragile. Community plays a central role in reinforcing this shift. Social cohesion is preserved through restraint rather than enthusiasm. Emotional expression exists, but it is rarely amplified. Celebrations are modest. Disagreements are softened. The cultural emphasis is not on standing out, but on fitting smoothly within shared norms. Over time, Americans often find their own emotional range narrowing, not through suppression, but through adaptation to a calmer collective tone. This environment subtly alters self-perception. Identity becomes less performative. The need to narrate personal ambition fades. Without constant external validation, self-worth detaches from speed and intensity. Life feels slower, but also more grounded. The nervous system adapts to fewer spikes, fewer abrupt demands for response, yet this transformation carries ambiguity. Some Americans interpret the shift as emotional quieting, a loss of sharp edges that once defined motivation. Others experience it as relief, a release from the internal pressure to constantly advance. Both reactions reflect the same underlying change, a movement away from urgency as a default state. In the end, life in Canada does not overwrite the American mindset. It reframes it. The instinct to push forward remains, but it is softened by patience. Ambition persists, but it is less public, less urgent. What emerges is a hybrid rhythm, one shaped by familiarity, restraint, and continuity. A reminder that culture does not always transform through impact. Sometimes, it rewires through calm repetition, quietly redefining what feels normal, valuable, and enough.